I do think you look at leadership from a different context than I have looked at it. And it doesn't mean that they're in opposition. It just means that there's some different things that we see in different language that we use. So I'm anxious to kind of explore that. Just the word leadership is a challenge, for example, because I don't mean it's the problem of language meaning different things in different contexts, and that's part of something you just have to work out. But I usually mean the quality and the essence of human behavior interaction as leadership, as opposed to positions of authority or which are also, they're leaders, they're executive leaders and political leaders, but whether they do it well or not is a manifestation of their leadership qualities in the way I use the term.
Maybe.
Maybe.
It's a good discussion. As you, I think, said in your first or second email, there are probably not many people who want to have this discussion at this level of depth, for sure. So it might be good that kind of in the end, you and I will have a chat, right? Which is also worthwhile. But that said, we're also not at it. So I thought when we discussed last year that by this time we would be further on in our journey. But in reality, we're still so deep in the theory. There's no popular product yet that you could easily put in front of an audience that is not in a similar amount of depth, right? So that's gonna. I have 3 more weeks until the University of Vienna transformation camp, and then the Change Now Paris presentation that I need to give. By then, it has to be popular.
This leadership framework is it's more of a tactical piece. It's not the whole purpose of the Prometheus project. The way we define our mission is we want to make leading clear and leaders common, which means we want to take this overly complex, I need a PhD in 6 subjects to understand leadership, to something that's pragmatic and commonplace, so that people in every role and every situation can take that leadership moment. And we don't think humble me is not going to accomplish that in the world, but that's what we're working towards. So how would we do that? And one of the necessary ingredients is that we need to find a way to think about leadership that's this funny balance between understandable and approachable, but yet suits the complexity, literally the complex system of complex systems that makes up who leaders are, what leaders do, and where leaders lead. Otti Vogt, who I've never met until this moment, or this day, this last hour, we've been exchanging jabs and comments back and forth on LinkedIn, and he nicely agreed to be a Voices guest because his passion and his depth of knowledge come across really clearly, and yet it sounds like we're speaking differently, even though we're trying not to speak past one another. And so, perfect opportunity to lean in to that difference and find out what's going on and seeing what we learn. So, Otti, tell us a little bit about who you are and your background and why you're so passionate about this topic of good leading.
Beyond the 85 slides, which I've brought to kind of show how simple we can make the complexity of leadership. How do I come to this? Well, my career is in practical leadership. So I found myself in leadership positions over the last 30 years. I started 5 companies right out of school, of which one was breaking even, 3 were disasters, and 1 was brilliant, which brought me through college, so to speak. During university, I was fascinated by volunteer organizations. I was a local committee president, as it was called in ISEC, the Global Student Association, and leading volunteer organizations has always kind of impressed me because you don't have financial stimuli to get people on board. So actually spending some time in volunteering, I think, is very healthy in terms of understanding the guts of leadership. And then I went into consulting because the internet bubble burst and all my business plans wouldn't find any funding. And if you kind of don't succeed in doing what you're doing, then you go into consulting and you advise other people not to do the same mistakes. So I spent a while in strategic consulting, got bored very quickly, and ended up in telecoms first, but in a specialized unit to drive large scale business transformation. And that was defined as £1 billion plus. And the group that I originally came into was writing a manual for developing such large-scale business transformation projects. And that was very, very interesting. And from there, I developed first through telecoms and I was very close to pharmaceuticals at some point as a client partner. And I ran lots of global operations from contact center to back office, etc. And the last 6 years, I've been in banking as a chief operating officer and chief transformation officer for ING, the global bank, running what some people described as the most radical transformation in European banking at the time. And it was a fantastic project. ING also being a poster boy for agile at scale. And that was part of my remit to create an agile organization in a very complex, global, highly regulated sector. So my background is really in large-scale business transformation. And over the last 4 years, I've been trying to redeem myself from having been part of financial services, working with the University of St. Gallen and trying to develop a model for what we call moral management. And since then, I don't get many invitations for cocktail parties anymore because some of the questions are really not the type of questions people want to answer.
Otti suggested that we start off with each of us giving a little bit of background. So, Otti, I'm going to go first. Since you have 80 slides and I only have about 8, I'm going to try to do the best to frame my perspective. A lot of what my experience is with the way we think of leadership, which we talk about our leadership framework, or maybe we're going to call it our leadership map because it seems a little less important to say map, is that we struggle with these human experiences, these shared human experiences that are captured in these 2 fables. One of them is the blind man and the elephant, and the other is the Tower of Babel. So in the blind man and the elephant, we look at the people looked at different parts of the elephant but couldn't see the whole thing, and so they developed, the phenomenology of their experience and how they understood it and how they built language around it was very specific to the part of the elephant that they could see, but few of them took the time to try to understand the elephant as a whole. Now, so that's one phenomena that we see in the leadership world about that. The Tower of Babel, I think most of us know this story from childhood or church, depending on what our culture is, but it's where people couldn't speak the same language, and so they were dysfunctional. And so what I observed is that because a lot of people focus on different disciplines and different contexts, they develop language around those contexts. It's very hard for them to understand each other, and so that becomes one of the challenges. Now, just a couple months ago, I went and I read the Tower of Babel stories in the book of Genesis, and I didn't ever realize this or didn't remember it, that the story goes that God or the gods, whoever was looking down on man, and they saw that man was building this fantastic tower. And so they imposed on them this problem of language, that they didn't understand each other because they felt that man would be too powerful if they actually spoke the same language. Now, I think that's a fascinating twist on that story about the potential of actually taking this time to, one of my early heroes, Mortimer Adler, was a philosophical historian, I think would be describing of him. He coined a term, I think, coming to terms, when you understand things cross disciplines or cross functions or cross authors even, that the biggest challenge in learning and understanding is coming to terms. And he meant figuring out what exactly people are talking about, despite the language they're using, because the language is often a miscue. So in the Prometheus work, we tried to look cross-discipline, cross-context, across multiple authors to try to figure out what is it that people are really talking about when they're talking about leadership. And we did, leadership development, leadership theory, adult development and learning, design and innovation from a product innovation standpoint, where creation was happening, businesses and organizations, psychology and social dynamics, systems theory and complexity theory. I'd say we covered bases, and in some case, it's at least brought in very substantial people to talk to on all these different areas to try to say, what are the patterns that are common across all these areas and universal in the sense that they apply to every context where leading is taking place? So how do you boil leadership down to its essences? Now, I admit that we did not look at much at philosophy and political science. And a lot of what I hear from Otti is philosophy and political science, but I didn't know this business background that you had and this business transformation background that you have. So actually, we have that in common. I have the hypothesis that a lot of the language that Otti uses, or the context that he's solving for, is just something I haven't spent enough time in. So I'm bound to learn something here. So this is the Tower of Babel, coming to terms between what do we both see and how are we both describing it type of experience today. Now, a little bit more about the Prometheus view. There's probably too much here to cover. I won't say it, but this is my summary of what we tried to, the values, the principles we tried to meet when we came up with what we have and still evolve on our leadership framework. So it should be universal or always true, essential. Adaptive, meaning we can assemble it or use it or apply it in contexts and whatever possibilities there are. So it's a toolkit, not a hammer. It's useful. It has effect. It's pragmatic. I quote here I'm not a religious person by practice, but a second biblical quote here: "You shall know them by their fruits." Right? It makes a difference whether it's there or not. It's sustainable, which means it's rooted in what I call here generative human experience, because it's not rooted in things outside of who we are, because who we are is really what we're going to respond to in the long run, I believe. It's generative. It has good effects. It's Hitler versus someone good. It's approachable, so without pretense, suited for the bar room, while non-reductionist. That's a really hard principle to live up to, making it so simple without taking away its meaning. Scalable, meaning it's true and useful locally and globally, and that you can learn and build it over time, because you can't learn leadership in one snap. You've got to learn it in increments and parts and experience. It's flexible. Maybe this is similar to adaptive, meaning it's adaptive to context. Sorry for the repetitiveness. It's authentic, meaning it's non-performative. It's not, I'm going to be a charismatic leader, so now I have to learn how to be charismatic. It needs to be about who you are. And reflective, meaning we can notice it in our experience. It's available for our reflection. It's not in our head conceptualization. It's in a practice that we do and that we can learn and reflect from. So there's some things. Now, here's too complicated here. The pragmatic demands of leading and the language of good leading are situational, meaning how I think about leading one-to-one and how I think about leading in politics or in a business executive position are the essences of leading are the same, but the demands, the scope of what I have to bring to those situations changes. Here, the juxtaposition of elements of who leaders are and what leaders do is there's patterns to it, but they're always unique. That's because it is a complex natural system. That would be true of complex natural systems. So it's also true of leadership. And you can define its parts, but you can only vaguely define the whole. And so we use this metaphor of the map and the territory, which we actually came up with ourselves, but we find out that Gregory Bateson and Nora Bateson are kind of famous for making this distinction between it's the map, not the territory, it's the menu, not the meals, another way that's expressed, that the reality of who we are and where the context we're in and how we can lead in that context is as complex and as uncapturable as you can imagine, but we can create a map, a guide, a way to understand it and a way to see it and engage it. And so this framework that we have is meant to be the map and not the scientific definition of leadership as a thing. A really important thing, the way we think, is that, again, the capacities we need for good leading are contextual, and the context vary by, we say, place, time, and people. So we have the leader, who's the person who's has the opportunity to lead, to make a change, make a decision, and we have contexts that scale from one to team to organizational to institutional to government to society as a whole, and um, how we talk about leader and what our capacities are to lead and the possibilities and the effort to make change in those vary in each of those circumstances, but all of them have essential elements. So here we go. Leadership is a complex system of complex systems that behave unpredictably but have coherence. Our little image of this pattern versus the reality. The framework, or the map, points to the essential elements with which leadership in any situation can be assessed and assembled. It happens to have 12 lenses, one core operation, 2 meta domains, and 4 domains. We draw a picture of it like this. These are the meta domains. This is the leader. This is the leading, the action, which is always social. The core is this green, that from our humanity, we engage and we notice and respond. We make choices, and we make them towards some conscious or implicit intent of what we want. For example, good leadership. Sometimes we show it with more words so you can get a better idea what it looks like. And when I think of Otti, based on his posts, without really necessarily knowing him, I can see that he talks about values and what's important and what we should be committed to. I think I think of him speaking, at least posting, a lot about society and political situations and good organizations. So the top part of those contexts. So what makes good organizations and good institutions? Who are we speaking to? Is it left, right, center, for example? And are we learning the lessons of history? Are we applying them to the present? And are we trying to create something of a promise that we have for ourselves? And then I think a lot of what again, Otti will correct me, but what he's trying to create in terms of artifacts are some clarity. Let's be very clear about what we think the norms are, or the choices are, or the values are that we want to see in place. And let's be more clear about whose power we're trying to afford. And let's be a little less compromising about the results that we see. Go, Otti. That's my 10 minutes.
Very nice. Very nice. Thanks for that. It really helps to, as you say, understand the different lenses in kind of translating the messages. And frankly, when you went through your framework, I see the similarities, which probably again shows that we are all, and I guess if everybody on the call is following you, Tom, then we're probably all at a quite complex level of thinking. I was talking to Gary about his research in neuroscience when we started, right? And which again I think shows we are quite deep in the subject matter. So I will take over and just share with you some of the insights that we encountered. And Tom asked me to talk about stuff that interests me. The problem is the one slide, Tom, that you showed with all the different disciplines. I'm interested in lots of stuff, and therefore I've got lots of things that I can show. We won't have enough time for everything, so I'm probably going to be a little bit fast and furious and just use what you just showed, Tom, as a guardrail to go into some of my thoughts on it. One thing that immediately comes up, I would say, is our inquiry is normative. And I want to make that distinction right at the start. There's a big difference between descriptive science, psychology or natural sciences, or kind of other sciences that are based on observation, vis-a-vis normative science, which are trying to define what we should be doing. And bridging the two, at least most people would agree, is a naturalistic fallacy. Just because something is doesn't mean that it should be. Just because on Mondays the sun comes out doesn't mean that on Monday the sun should come out. Just because whatever God created the world, if we believe that, it doesn't mean that we need to follow what God said just because He creates a so-called genetic fallacy. So one of the biggest challenges that we started our inquiry with is the question of what should we do? Aristotle famously, when he wrote his Nicomachean Ethic, started with the question, why should we get up and do anything, right? So what makes our action, what makes our lives good? And this is not easy, especially as you said, Tom, with your elephant picture. We all have different views of and perspectives of the world, but most importantly, in this postmodernism in which we're living, we all believe that our perspective is true, right? So there's a McIntyre called it the threat of emotivism and relativism, right? Because we somehow, whenever I talk about good things, the first question I get is, says who? Right, we are so embedded in this kind of individualistic, subjectivist epistemology that kind of we're not asking what is the argument or what is the better argument anymore, which was the fundamental premise of a Socratic inquiry, if you want, right, or a dialectical process. No, we're asking says who, right, and we don't want to believe in authority of the books anymore, but we always need to know who says something to then ascertain whether it has any truth value or not. It's kind of paradox, if you want, and. So let me share, and I think I have created some slides with the agenda. So let me see. Give me a hint when you can see the slide.
We can see them.
Excellent.
Good.
Okay, let me go from here. So I've called this the road less traveled, which I now need to correct because Tom, you're traveling, you're a co-traveler, and maybe some of you on the calls are also co-traveler. I called this the road less traveled because it's like a travel diary. And I haven't found many other travelers on the road. It's also a bit of a homage to Scotty Peck, who wrote a book with the same title. But why are so few people on this road? One, because conventional business schools don't like heterodox economics, right? So they're going beyond what is a useful functional instrumental is very rare. Secondly, academics also don't like it because in academia, if you want to get somewhere, you have to be focused on one discipline. And we are by definition doing transdisciplinary inquiries. Right, so there are not many people are on this road. What is our particular road? Well, I already anticipated it. So with a colleague, Antoinette Weibel, professor for management at the University of St. Gallen, we've been busy for 4 years now trying to define what we call the moral theory of management. And mostly we have invested into 4 different types of conversations, if you want. The first is really focused on foundational research, and we've been running a series of talks called Leaders for Humanity, where we kind of interview famous or insightful academics and scholars, especially bridge builders who kind of can go from one discipline to another. The second is about more practically, what are the good practices for ethical organizations? Here again, there's a part of theoretical research. There's also part of practical interviews. So we're now, I think I've interviewed the first 20 organizations that try to combine agility and corporate social responsibility to kind of glean what works in practice. But also we're working with B Corp and Economy for Common Good and others on certification of good organizations. Thirdly, we're very interested in leadership, and we have spent a lot of time trying to think about leadership. And our approach is wisdom-centric. And let's see if I get to explain what that means. And finally, we kind of came to realize, and I think, Tom, you kind of alluded to that already, that you can try to create good leaders in bad organizations. It's going to take a few weeks and they're out. You can try to create good leaders in good organizations. If they're in a bad market, they're going to survive a few years and then they're out too. So the market has a tendency to not value ethical organizations. Therefore, we got involved with our Business for Humanity interview series into alternatives to capitalism. So an inquiry at the macro level in understanding how we can build economies that kind of promote good organizations, or at least kind of let them survive. So these are the kind of inquiries that we're running in parallel, and there are other projects, and I might touch on them a little bit once we go. Here are we've done around 100 interviews now, but here's some of the faces. As you can see, there's Leaders for Humanity on the left, and we've got Business for Humanity. And we also went into practitioner interviews, especially with HR people. And let's see if I get to that later. What I had in mind, and I think now we cannot cover all of this because we don't have the time, but I wanted to first, a little bit like Tom, in my words, share the awesome complexity of leadership as we have experienced it on this road less traveled for the last 4 years. And some of the things we've picked up just to see if they resonate with you, and then we could have a quick chat about that. Secondly, based on that understanding of reality, exactly as Tom said, so the Tower of Babel and the elephant, we've tried to construct a transformation model for business, which we call Freedom to Flourish. And we've presented the beta last year in Amsterdam. And I got a video to show that, but as I said, I don't know whether we will go there. And I explained why kind of that is important. And the third part is about, okay, what does this all mean for leadership? And there's a sense in this order, because for us, the question was really, what is good and what does that mean in the complexity of the world? Secondly, how would we translate that into an organization? So what does it mean to take a conventional business and make it good? And then leadership is really that momentum to get from a business when it's created to becoming a good business that creates social flourishing in the world. So leadership for us is instrumental, if you want. It's a role that has to do with getting an organization on the way towards that positive transformation. And that's why we needed the first two pieces first. What is good in this complex world? What does it mean if you translate it into management, into business? And finally, therefore, what would it require of leaders to support that type of change? Right? And that's why I'm always saying, for me, leadership is not about the leader as a person. I couldn't care less. I mean, as a person, I care a lot, but in terms of the methodology, I couldn't care less. A leader is stepping into a role that has a significance within that institutional context of creating organizations that are good for society. But what does that all mean? So let me start from something simple. I guess kind of when we start talk about good leadership, it's kind of easier to look at bad leadership. And I will make the claim that people running around with toilet seats and chainsaws are not necessarily very good leaders, right? But that is kind of hanging the bar relatively low, you might say, but it really depends on how we define leadership. And when you go for literature, you will often find, in some kind of flowery words, a functional definition of leadership, which has to do with kind of taking an organization from A to B, right? Or if you're more sophisticated, then that implies that there are leaders who take the organization from A to B by manipulating a set of resources, which includes human resources, from C to D. And somehow there's a difference between leadership at the level of the system of the organization as a whole, leaders as the individuals that have a role in making that happen, but there also seems to be followership, which is quite interesting as a necessary element that relates to leadership. The other thing that I want to call out here, which I will come back to when it goes to wisdom, is also there's a little bit of an assumption already that you can see whereby the leaders are able to kind of discern the situation in A, they understand the reality, they have a vision of the situation in B, right, where to go to, they have the competency to make choices that relate to the resources to make that happen, and they can execute that. So there's some sort of mechanism already implied by this functional picture. But as it turns out, it's not as easy as it looks. But if we go backwards and try to analyze some of the traditional theories of leadership over the last 100 years, and I've written a little blog post about this once, and you can see the QR code there. What we can see is that the theories kind of follow what Simon Weston calls the kind of great discourses of leadership. So you start with the trait theories, and then you got styles and contingencies, and then you get up to servant leadership in the end, and so on. But I think behind all this multicolored variation and lots of academic kind of innovation in terms of terms and concepts, most of it goes back to what I call the regression model of leadership. What does that mean? We are trying to define the point B of that earlier equation simply in terms of performance. So we say a good business is one that performs, and we measure that through profit or share price. And now we run a regression analysis, right? We load as many case studies as we can, and we try to figure out the factors that somehow have meaningful relationship with the end result. And what were the factors? Well, the character traits of the great man theory of leaders, all men, of course. Right? So what are the individual character traits? They were loaded into the regression analysis. Then that wasn't good enough, so we try to understand the relationship between the leader and the organization, which was always treated as a black box because who knows how that thing works, which led us to behaviors and styles. And then we try to figure out, oh, actually, there are different types of context for organizations. So an organization that is a stable market leader vis-a-vis one that is going through a turnaround, vis-a-vis one that does a mergers or an acquisition or something. And we try to figure that also into this regression analysis to kind of solve for the types of leaders that we should hire. And that type of leadership model, of course, has all sorts of problems. Oops. And I will try to point out 5 problems, and they kind of are very close to what Tom talked about at the beginning. Right? I will talk about the ontological problem, the epistemological problem, the political problem, and then if we get there, the ethical problem and the transformation problem. Because what we can see in this kind of linear, positivist, analytical formula is, of course, abstracting reality very unduly, so to speak. But before I go there, I want to kind of live up to my own failures here a little bit, in inverted commas. As many popular leadership writers and as many popular leadership discourses, I also first went to psychology. I'm a qualified executive leadership coach in what is called system psychodynamics. And you can see here the link to an essay I wrote about letting go of leadership from a psychodynamics perspective, which I did for kind of INSEAD as part of my certification, which was also published by Routledge in this book on transpersonal leadership. What I want to say with that is, I think psychodynamics, psychology, the individual perspective of leaders and how leadership is lived in a relational space is important, but it's not enough. Right, so I started from there, being trained in psychology and psychodynamics. I started with that, and when I decided to leave the bank, I decided to go further beyond a discussion on just psychology, psychological safety, and so on. So let me go to the first problem, which is the kind of ontological problem. Here I'll look at my notes to make sure that I give you some of the input. And I think when it comes to ontology, so the science of what is real, the first big problem is that every methodology is anchored in an ontology. There's a logical chain that goes from ontology to epistemology to methodology to method to data point. And most authors, including many academics, have never studied philosophy of science to a sufficient degree and therefore never really examined their own belief into what is real. And that goes a little bit to the elephant picture that Tom was showing. And this, by the way, goes also for most of the people talking about complexity and complex adaptive systems or quantum science when conflating biological or physical metaphors into the social space very unduly again. But most people start from a scientific worldview, which is this kind of analytical, linear perspective that is implicit in the regression analysis, which relates to what is called the hypothetical deductive model of science. So in a nutshell, our scientific models is based on empiricism, as David Hume's, right? So if we see A and then we always say B, we can create a covering law, as it's called, that when A, if and only if A, then always B. So we're formulating laws based on observation, right? So based on what we can see in our sense data, we are creating causality. There's a lot of problem with this when it comes to social systems. And of course, by the way, we create that causality and then we try to manipulate systems on that basis, right? So the moment we've got this cover law, then we try to maximize B by getting everybody to do A, right? So it's kind of Taylorism in excellence, in excellence. What we have done, we looked into a lot of differences. You can see some of the books on the sides, from the social fields in Bourdieu to the theories of Giddens and so on, structuration theory. And the model that we believe is most suited for the analysis of complex social systems is what is called critical realism. It's proposed by Roy Baska and people like Margaret Archer and Dave Elder-Vass. And it basically posits that under the surface of social systems, we find a number of entities that are relevant for the analysis of what is really going on. And they show, for example, that people and the relationships amongst them, social technical structures, and culture, which includes the kind of language and the value, exactly as Tom pointed out, those are entities that have discrete powers, but due to a certain configuration of them and between them, they interact with open systems in a way to make certain events occur. And if these events in the open system get supported, then we will see that as visible performance or patterns of behavior. There are a few important things in this picture. So one, it is a stratified depth ontology. So there are different layers of ontology, and normally, as I said, this kind of positivism only plays at the empirical level. So here, the critical realism forces us to examine what is going on underneath what we see. It also points to, as the name says, positivism not being complete. There's also the importance of absences. So if you're looking at a picture and you're seeing, let's assume you're looking at a hair salon where there's a person running around crazily and you cannot see anything, you don't know what's going on. From an empirical standpoint, it's very difficult to draw any conclusions from that, because what really happened is there was a client who was supposed to be there at 3 o'clock, who every week comes at 3 o'clock, but that day that client wasn't there. So the absence is equally causal, not only a positive presence of an empirical observation. I know that's a bit of a problematic concept, but if anyone is interested in ontology, I really invite you to have a look at critical realism, because it brings the absence and the negativity into the situation where our model of thinking in Western science is really based on presence and positivity. The other thing that is really important, I think, in this model is socio-technical structures. In my observation, people believe in their agentic capacity, but I would say 80% of our behaviors is predicated on institutions. It's actually not based on our own consciousness and will. It's based on the type of environments within which you find ourselves, right? And therefore, this critical realism points to the importance of institutions. And finally, the other aspect here is the open system. This is why natural science cannot easily be translated into social science, because there's agency on the one hand, and secondly, there's unpredictability when it comes to the confluence of different events within that open system. Even if I have created a certain mechanism underneath, so I have an organization that has a certain configuration in terms of structures and people, that doesn't necessarily mean that I will see the outcomes, because lots of things could happen in the market space, in the world, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of indeterminateness in the way that social outcomes are being produced. This is why we cannot run experiments, because experiments by definition only happen in closed systems, right? And this is why Baska has a very, very intelligent, very, very interesting critique of using science in social systems. So this is the first part. The second part is, and I have 3 parts. The second part is the world, the social world is dynamic. And this is Archer's morphogenetic cycle, which you can see. And it goes from left to right. T1 is the first time, T2 is in the intermediate, and T3 is the final part of the temporal circle. So what Baska pointed to was so-called synchronic emergence. So things emerge from these generative mechanisms and structures underneath. This is diachronic emergence. So things happen throughout time. They're connected. And the problem here with social systems is every social interaction is contextual. From the moment we are born into a social space. So the T1 on that diagram, so structural conditioning, even if we don't realize it, we're already part of something. We become part of the system before we kind of ever learn to free ourselves from the system, so to speak. So people, structure, and culture are in a path-dependent configuration at the start. Then what happens in T2, there's a political struggle of different interests coming into the social space. And this is where Archer, I think, is really strong, as Tom pointed out, bringing that political element in. Different people pursue different interests. And as a result of that interaction, we will either find that a structural precondition is being maintained. So the status quo is actually a result of a dynamic struggle where people reproduce the existing kind of condition of the system through their action, or they enable the change of that. And this brings us to the kind of three important element in this critical realism ontology: ontological realism, which means there's depth in the ontology; epistemic relativism, different actors see the space from different perspectives, again, Tom's kind of elephant, and they pursue different interests based on their perspectiveness and position inside the space. But there's hope in terms of what is called judgmental rationality. So rather than what McIntyre suggested, we all become relativists, there is a vantage point from which we can try to analyze what's going on in the system. So we can try to figure out whether the narratives, the communications, the different vantage points that people kind of pursue are true and real, at least to a certain extent, to figure out whether there's a capital B, better way of doing. And finally, my third aspect of ontology, and kind of interesting to spend 10 minutes on ontology, but I really think this is important. The third aspect is, so we said it's deep, it's dynamic in terms of temporality, it's fragmented. So I'm here, my kind of, well, how do they call it in a tribunal? My artifact, my evidence is Bhaska's so-called social cube. So what Roy Bhaska suggests is that we are existentially exposed to boundaries. And he is highlighting 4 different boundaries. So between us on this call, so between one person and another, there's a potential boundary. Between us all together as a civic society and the state, there's another boundary. Between us as the state and nature, there's another boundary. And then going back to my discussion with Gary, between us and our inner self and our inner desires and kind of our kind of inner biology, etc., there's another boundary. So Bhaska says, whatever the social space, there are some existential boundaries which get expressed as, and this is where I'm taking paradox signs, and you can see again some of the books, which very often we find as paradoxes. So between going for profitability or going for environmental sustainability, that could be seen as a paradox and is seen as a paradox in many kind of the recent scholarships. The other key paradoxes I'm building here on Lewis and I've forgotten the dynamic equilibrium model, Simon Lewis. They identify 4 discrete paradoxes, which I think resonate very strongly with Bhaska's existential boundaries in the space. So there's a learning boundary which relates to the question: should we stay or should we go? Should we change or should we be stable, right? There's an organizational paradox, which is about control versus flexibility, right? Which relates to, again, the autonomy of the citizen vis-a-vis the state, if you want, in a social space. Belonging, which is the interrelational paradox between me and Naomi, me and Julie, right? So what's the individual versus the collective, us all in this group? It's a belonging paradox, they say. And then I already mentioned performance. So what's the kind of paradox in terms of pursuing multiple outcomes in the system? Now, what I will add here, just again, as a glimpse in terms of what we have been researching, I think paradox theory is mostly wrong. We reverted to what is called dialectical theory. And dialectical theory is based on Hegel and Marx and some more contemporary thinkers via Koyev to Zizek and others. In dialectics, conflict is good. What paradox theory ultimately suggests is that we need to learn to cope with existential contradictions. And that might sometime, again, looking at Gary in terms of PTSD research, coping with trauma might sometimes be a very good idea at individual level. But we're suggesting that constructive conflict, so the dialectics of evolution, is actually a motor for societal change. And what Bhaska in his dialectical critical realism advocates for, and I will come back to that, is a dialectics of truth and freedom. So he suggests that social systems evolve because they're getting better at understanding what is true, what is real, and yearning for freedom. So he says the drive for freedom is the basic motor that generates this societal change that you saw in the morphogenetic cycle of Archer. So this is my discussion on ontology. Problem number one. Problem number two, I'm coming to the Babel's Tower. So we have now figured out reality has a number of entities. They're in configurations. They change all the times. There are actors who are supporting them. And there might be a problem with paradoxes that attract our attention and the different interests that, of course, have power behind them. So this is where power comes into the picture. But here we go, as Tom already alluded to, we go into political science, because when it comes to figuring out how society is yielding its ultimate goal, which is social justice since the Republic of Plato, and how different actors play out in the context of power struggles. And as someone famously said, political science has two questions. The first question is who gets what, and the second question is says who. Right? So in the American version of political science, and here I would say this is political sociology as opposed to philosophy of science, descriptive as opposed to normative. The question is one of values. So what we now get to is, so we have some boundaries between me and others, between the organization and nature, etc. And how I see these boundaries creates tension in society. And as Nancy Fraser says, these tensions are value-oriented. And we can discern here in the picture 6 different contemporary ideologies. I don't have the time to go into that, but happy to answer any questions, where you can see different standpoints when it comes to evaluating these boundaries and contradictions. You got idealism, which is kind of classical theology, or to a degree also virtue ethics and the likes. Conservatism, libertarianism, which is the classical liberalism, modern liberalism, you can read it as social democracy if you want, communitarianism, and in the green color I've included here the environmentalism, and socialism or communism. So you got 6, to abstract it and make it easy, 6 different ideologies that look into this space. And the problem is what you see in the world depends very much on how you look at it. So you can already see these 6 ideologies represented by the different colors. And I realize, oh yeah, I know why the red isn't there. I'll come to that in a second. On the 2 axes, in terms of A, what is true, and B, what is good, they have very different positions. I'm not going to dwell on this. There's a lot more behind it. But what it leads to is that their view as to how we should govern our societies, how we should develop ourselves, becomes very different. So the conservatives want a local, pluralistic kind of community based on tradition and based on original values at the bottom right. The libertarian actually take a lot of insights from military communities. If you think about it, and I'm going to come to that in the organizational space, a lot of the progress in society is based on wars, sadly. And Robert Nisbet is a sociologist who's written a lot about this. Then in the middle on the right, you have kind of the kinship community. So it's based on loyalty. And on the left, you got, as I said, social democracy, which is a political community based on social contract. You have, in a socialist sense, a revolutionary community, which wants to change the current system and move towards a classless society. And then at the top, you have an kind of an ecological community and religious community. To bring it a little bit into our space, let me translate it into businesses. And again, I'm not arguing that an ideology necessarily determines the governance system, but I would say these are archetypical. So in the kind of conservative sense, you would have a partnership which is based on ethos and virtues. At the bottom right, a typical shareholder company that's out there to kind of win in the marketplace. You got the typical non-profit state bureaucracy in the middle on the left, family businesses, cooperatives, and in the theological space, you have kind of a typical charity or hospital. Right? So you can see, based on ideology, we are getting into the form of these social structures that we're finding in the kind of generative mechanisms underneath. And depending on this type of society that we're surrounded by, it will, of course, trigger our behaviors. And in a nutshell, what I want to say in concluding Tom's picture of the elephant in the Babel, in my own words, think about gravity. So the typical formula for gravity on the top right, force equals the gravity constants times mass 1, mass 2 divided by the square of the difference. That is a good approximation for many times. So the leadership formula might work if there's a small company, the leader is the dominant person, and you have a very stable environment. But for all other environments, we might need to go much deeper and disentangle what Einstein called space-time, right? Where the apple in reality doesn't fall straight to the ground, but it falls in line with the space-time patterns, right? So our patterns in the social world are shaped by the types of institutions, the type of relationships, and the ideologies, discourses, and communication patterns that are around. And that's, if we want to really understand truth, we need to go into more depth around that. And I'm going to close on this part here by saying, on the right again, you have some of these thinkers that deal with complexity science and so on. But the point I'm making is I can very easily prove that a lot of the discourses that we're surrounded by in businesses, be it about performance management or leadership, I can clearly allocate back to the different political ideologies, right? And here I just put in Nelson Mandela, Tom, because you asked it. Nelson Mandela was a socialist. And when he was liberated, the first person he thanked was Fidel Castro in Cuba, right? He has been mass appropriated as the good African by Western forces, where Margaret Thatcher, kind of still a year before he was liberated, was talking about him as a terrorist. And so again, ideology does all sorts of very interesting things, including assimilation of useful alternatives, right? Nancy Fraser talks about progressive neoliberalism, which has included all the originally challenging aspects of feminism, right? And as she said, feminism fails today because with DEI, etc., neoliberalism has integrated it into its own world. Now that's all theory, and now I'm going to rush through just a few pictures, and then I'm going to stop I'm sure there might be some reflections. If you now translate that into the actual space, because so far we've talked about, okay, ideology and ontology, what does it mean if we now try to situate an organization in this broader world? Then we can see again there are different paradoxes, if you want. So on the left, you got an organization as part of a societal space, an institutional space, where it's constitutive of a market, which is constitutive of the nation state. Then in the middle, you have the technical dependency, the paradox of kind of our production system vis-a-vis the natural world. And on the right, you have the embedded in the social world. And especially through our analysis of Business for Humanity, we went deep into this. And I cannot really go into details, but the first question is, what should the state be accountable for? What should the market be accountable for? This is called political economics. And since Adam Smith, it was called political economics until in the last century, people dropped the political, only called it economics, and as Ed Freeman suggested, created this separation thesis, suggesting that the markets has its own laws and its own morality and kind of is completely different from the rest of the institutional estate, which of course is nonsense, as there are no free markets. But there are different ways of creating the context for these markets. So on the yellow color is neoliberalism, which is the kind of competitive state market, the minimum space state. Then you have the mixed economy or the welfare state and social democracy. You've got a command economy in the socialist space and a civil economy when it comes to interaction in a more embedded fashion, right? And you can go into all sorts of details. So we analyzed public finances and how the role of the public as entrepreneur, as Mariana Mazzucato suggests, pursues missions. We looked at macroeconomic policy. What's the difference between demand side and supply side, or Keynesian type of macroeconomic policy? And what does it mean for businesses? Should we go for taxation or not? Should the state invest in measures to transition towards the Green New Deal? This is the European Green New Deal, which is in degree of complication took me a week to understand what they're trying to do. And now we have all the marasma and all the complication with the omnibus regulation going on, right? Which is being renegotiated. Many of you might have followed the discussion. The European trading scheme, right? Carbon pricing. Is that moral? Is it working? Financial securities tax, why don't we have it, right? So you're getting into all sorts of policy interventions which impact businesses. And we as business leaders, I suggest, should have a viewpoint, because we are the economy, so to speak. So we need to understand whether these are good policy measures or not. Corporate governance, what does it mean? Many people pretend that corporate governance doesn't allow a multi-stakeholder set of statutes, which of course is wrong. But we analyze things like B Corp and benefit corporations and the likes to understand to what degree supervisory boards and shareholders have primacy or have ability to pursue kind of sustainability objectives and the likes. And you've seen all the backlash with the ESG regulations at the moment, especially in the United States. But what does the law say? To what degree can a shareholder-owned company ever be good? Right? If that is implying shareholder primacy and therefore the maximization of profits as the ultimate goal. And then we go into the economic system. And here again, it's not enough to just look at the businesses, right? So there's as we said, the boundary with neighbor, with the people, there's the finance system and the state, all interacting in the capitalist economy. As Paul Adler is telling us very nicely in his 99% economy, the capitalist economy seems to be creating lots of direct and indirect crises. So any type of posture that we as businesses want to have, we need to test whether in the context of the economic system, so before I talked about the boundary between state and economics, now I'm in the market, right? Is it a useful intervention? What is our collective accountability? Not only one business, but businesses together within an ecosystem. Think food, think transport, or mobility, think construction. What is our collective duty in order to changing the economic system in such a way that it mitigates some of these crises that we see on this slide? And again, you go into different theories, right? So the classical economics is loved by the conservatives. We have got neoclassical economics and Austrian or Schumpeterian economics, which is loved by neoliberals. So here you're getting into, again, a very strong relationship between the type of answers that are being suggested, the type of economic theories, and of course only the neoliberal, neoclassical is being taught in business schools, and the type of ideologies that sit behind that. So again, as Tom said, this is complex, right? Because if you don't know where other people stand, it's very hard to disentangle this kind of complexity. One thing is, I would say, certain that our traditional way, I'm looking at my MBA, which at the time was at London Business School, which prided itself as being the #1 business school in the world, and that was its mission, being the #1. That was good enough, whatever that meant. What I have learned, the value chain, Porter's value chain on the left, that is not a good representation of how the world works. And here again, you can see the ideological blinds of our traditional teaching in business schools. Right? On the right, you've got a circular economy by Walter Stahill or the MacArthur Foundation, etc., which starts with nature and ends with waste and nature, right? And seeks a triple R, a circular type of economy. That is not the same as the value chain of Porter, which doesn't care where the resources come from, doesn't give a shit where the products end when they're wasted, and is implicit in the kind of maximization logic, a profit orientation of the enterprise, right? So this is highly problematic. The biggest question in the elephant in the room is, of course, can capitalism ever work without growth? Right? Is there a growth imperative in capitalism? We've done some analysis, and I think the answer is mostly yes. The second question is lower growth actually possible? Again, we've done some analysis. Here's a model by Tim Jackson and Peter Victor. There are some opportunities to do so. Finally, the social boundaries, because again, we can go abstract and high level, but we also need to go down particular place bound and low level, where again, we see the concept of a social license in order for businesses to actually be legitimated in terms of their operations. It's not only the market, there are also non-market logics. And it's not only about the individual organization, it's about how it is inserted in a logic of place. So how it interacts with other private and public actors in a specific place-bound community to create whatever that community values, which could include questions about living wages. And here, I'll leave it there. We've analyzed 10 different paradigms so far when it comes to alternatives to capitalism. So far, nobody has found the silver bullet as to how to resolve all the troubles that we seem to have created. But what my conclusion from all this discussion is, this is a highly complex space before we even start to talk about the inner world of the organization. What does it mean to be a business that is responsible in an economy, in a society, right? It's a very complex discussion, and political science is the one providing answers when it comes to what responsibility means in a liberal constitution or constitutional republic, so to speak. Therefore, all the books here are about political science. My view is the civic economy view on the left. So I believe that an organization needs to contribute to a civil economy that contributes to a good society. And it also, and here we get to the second part of the equation, and then I'm hopefully done with this. Sorry for a long walk. But you remember I talked about the responsibility of the enterprise at the moment. I also said at the beginning, leaders have a responsibility towards resources, which include people. But arguably, from a political perspective, a republic is as good as the people that it produces. So there's a vantage point by which we can say a good organization is only an organization, is only good as an organization if it creates people who are good, so to speak. Right? So this introduces, the first is politics, the second is ethics. Politics is about how to create a just society. Ethics is about how to create a good life for an individual or choose a good action. And when it comes to ethics, we are kind of encountering the same problem here. Traditionally, we can analyze different ethical theories from the most famous ones, the deontological. This is Kant, utilitarianism, Bentham and Mill. We could go to religious theories, Catholic social teaching, contract-based theories. That's John Rawls most famously, virtue ethics and care ethics, and other things that are about relativism and motivism. And in our society, those are the ones that are most preferred, but they certainly don't exhaust the ethical theories that are available if someone sits down to look at the 2.5 millennia of moral philosophy that are available. And as it so happens, the one that we, after doing comparative analysis, prefer is virtue ethics. If I summarize the kind of meaning of the different ethical theories for work, you could say that in a duty logic, work becomes a professional duty or something that you kind of should be doing. It's like the Protestant work logic, right? From a utilitarian perspective, work is a ticket to freedom and pleasure on the bottom right in the yellow. In a communitarian logic, work is an opportunity to participate, and it's about the collective, the community. And in a virtue ethics logic, work is about self-actualization and flourishing through the cultivation of character. And this is a logic which we think is most promising because it turns the organization around to say it's actually not the outcomes that matter, it's the journey. It's how we create a type of interaction between ourselves and the rest of the world that creates good people, that creates a good life for all of us. And here I started to write little posts about starting with who, kind of making a little bit of fun of some cynics starting with why. But the point is a little bit different, and it's kind of interesting to look at geometry of ethics. For many years in CSR, corporate social responsibility, we used planet, profit, people, or kind of triple bottom line Venn diagrams. The problem with a Venn diagram is, firstly, it's putting all the different aspects on the same plane. But same with stakeholder logic, right? The state isn't another stakeholder. The state is creating the infrastructure within which we are legitimated in the way we operate, right? And between the triple bottom line, and John Elkington famously asked to withdraw his triple bottom line concept at some point, of course, there was very little intersectionality. At the end of the day, the only sphere people were really interested in was profit. But it's a problem with the Venn diagram as an articulation of what we should be going after, because it's a minimum consensus logic. Whereas virtue ethics is an essentialist logic. It's a logic of concentric circles. It starts with the hope of the best, the highest potential that is in us, that every human being carries within themselves. And the system is articulated as an architecture of potentiality, where the best within each other can be brought to life. It starts with the essence, and it seeks to bring that essence into everything that is being done. That's not the same as kind of creating win-win situations, etc., etc. So all that's to say that I think there are two problems that, however we define good leadership, we have to deal with. One is a problem of truth in how we intervene in social systems, And here we go, in my views, from the linear kind of formula to a much more complex dialectical evolution, and you find a punctuated equilibrium theory on the right. So this kind of idea, like Thomas Kuhn in I think it's social science, you could say, on scientific models, that you go from one converged belief set and ideology to another, and the question is, how do you trigger that process? What means better on that evolution of equilibria, however, has to be predicated on the understanding of ethics, which is constellationally included in politics. So on the question of how can we create societies that enable the good life of its citizen. And here I will stop. So that's a little tour de force to show this two simple pictures, Tom, that you had of the elephant in terms of ontology, the Babel Tower in terms of ideology, and I think the missing element, which is ethics, right? Where do we get from knowing what is to knowing what should be?
So I have two, maybe three observations. One is, oh my gosh, is a very fast romp through a lot of fire hose water. But I'm glad to have it laid out. Secondly, I always feel a little foolish, and I'm not sure how well received it is by more pragmatic people when I say that the essence of human is the manifestation of what's essential about people into the world. And I think I just heard you say the same thing, which is kind of cool. So I have to look at that, listen more closely, and follow up with you on that. The third thing is a question. Um, all your graphs and diagrams, I couldn't process it fast enough. So the one question I do have is, I think in problem 2, where you had truth and ethics as your dimensions, I didn't understand what you were trying to say there. Is there more truth or a different type of truth? Is there more ethics or different type of ethics? What are those axes in that model?
Yeah. And this is I'm happy to have any follow-up conversations. This is too fast, right? Unless people are familiar with the concepts and highly interested in them. But on that axis, so the way ideologies work is they're providing worldviews, which kind of they're like shortcuts. So they encapsulate a view of what is true and a view of what we should be doing in this world, right? That's what an ideology offers. Now, and then that chart, right? So the combination of, and you could say kind of the ethics is in popular terms, kind of what we care about and what we value, what we should care about, right? And what we should care about more in a society than other things, right? So on the truth axis, you have different vantage points in terms of a relational standpoint, where truth is relational, an analytical standpoint, where typically in a methodological individualism, right, it's all kind of islands, it's little atoms coming together. Relational is Ubuntu or I am because you are, right, the Martin Buber style of logic, or Levinas, if you want to take a philosophical perspective on that. And then the other aspect of this is an absolutist logic. It's a transcendental logic. So what is the world? The world is imago Dei, is what God created, right? Or in Plato's cave, what is the real world? Well, once you get out of the cave into the sun, that's the world of ideals. That's the real world. So you got like an absolute universalist perspective, a relational and often fluid process perspective, and an analytical kind of positivist, linear, atomist perspective. So these are kind of different worldviews that you can see in these different ideologies.
Okay, so it's just different perspectives of reality, right? There's the scientific perspective and then the transcendental on the other side, perhaps, or maybe it's just the individual, impulsive sense of, which might be closer to the transcendental, actually.
But you find these, I mean, beyond the difficult terms, right? You find these all day, right? So when I'm doing my business case analysis in a business, my truth is statistics. It's Excel spreadsheets, right? So my truth gets abstracted in a allegedly scientific financial numbers. That's what it is. HR very often uses, or hopefully uses, a relational perspective, right? So what is true there is what the people on the shop floor are telling me. There's surveys, interactions with people in the canteen, the true stories of what people tell me. If you go into the church, I can have a lot of confession with my pastor. Ultimately, what the truth is what is in Scripture, right? Or if you kind of, depending on the creed you follow, of course, right? But the reality is dictated by the city of God, not the temporary realm within which we are.
Yeah. And so what's the ethics? What's the continuum on the ethics
On that side,
axis?
so ethics, as I said, there are five grand theories of ethics: contractual, deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and if you want, care ethics, Carol Gilligan and the like.
Yeah, so
These are
how do
the
you line them up?
No, so this is in order to make that picture easier with the ideologies. There's another way to look at this, which is particular versus universals. And the universals, you're looking at abstracts and what is universally true, and that's very often leading you to either deontological logic, so duty-bound, Kantian, the Enlightenment man. So with your reason, you come to the ultimate precepts of how you should act. And as many people challenged him, that would probably mean you should tell the axe murderer where your wife is. Right? So there's kind of an absolute universal answer to ethical questions depending on the type of the act. That's very often universalist logic. In a particular logic, it's about contingent best action. So it's kind of the closest, the intimate space in the place. So tradition will give you the right answer. Or the loyalty, if you're a mafia member, then the loyalty to the family, the clan will provide you with the right answer. Or if you're an environmentalist, then whatever the demands of this river, if the river has a right to flow, therefore it's a wrong thing to provide a bridge. So you find the answers in the essentials of the place. Right? So there's a degree of particular versus abstraction. The problem is both are true. Right? John Rawls famously suggested a reflective equilibrium where you're kind of going with the local answers, enhancing a set of universal principles that you're trying to stay behind. Because if you don't do that, then slavery might still be a good idea. If there's some community somewhere that believes amongst themselves that would be a good principle for ethical acting, or take female mutilation, right? That in it leads to a cultural contextualism, as it's called, where in a certain tradition, in a certain family, certain things are declared to be right. Therefore, in order to avoid that problem, once you want to remain some of that, you want to have some of that contingency. Good, as Hegel said, is always a concrete singularity, but you want to test it against some universal principles. So you have always this tension between particular right action, universal principles, liberty, solidarity, fraternity, right? So you can use the French Revolution kind of principles to test against whether this is a good idea. And here I think you get into some dialectics, right? You get into the dialectics of, as Bhaskar said, kind of what is good and what is true. And when you see the truth, when you see especially the absences, so you see in the board that the people who are impacted are missing in the boardroom, you spot the absence. That almost implies a necessity to mitigate that absence, right? So it's the right thing if you spot something that is wrong in the world to try to do something against that. And so very often in liberal theories of justice, you get to a negative conception of justice. But you can hear, right? I mean, the depth you get into, right? It's just incredible. And then you, as you said, we at some point we need to resurface and bring it into language that a CEO in a boardroom would possibly go by, because nobody wants to study Hegel and for 15 years before they decide on a business case.
Yes, let alone the bar room and the boardroom. So I'm going to seed some more questions. No, you're not allowed to be stunned into silence. You must have some kind of question. Don't worry about whether or not you read Hegel or not. Otti won't be mean. He won't expect you to.
Yeah, let me also know if this is of any value for you guys, right? I mean, I realize, as I said, we are still in the middle of research, and as I told Tom, I need to present the next presentations at the University of Vienna in like 3 weeks' time. So by then, I need to resurface and produce something normal people in inverted commas will be able to understand. Shotgun.
We also, if you've come for a while, we have this idea of the elephant in the room, riffing on the elephant idea. There's always sometimes this unasked question that doesn't get asked because it's hard to formulate, or it's maybe too much of a challenge or too contrary. We're happy to have those types of questions because there's always good learning there. So
Just a bit of perspective. When you're talking about truths of different perspectives, what I'm often most curious about is how do you reconcile the truths of different perspectives? So let's take, for example, if you look at Viktor Frankl's experience in a concentration camp, it's a confined perspective. So I think oftentimes we see out in the world confined perspectives where their perspective can't be something else because they can't see beyond. And in the case of Plato's cave, it's not just being kind of ignorant of something on the outside, it's just not accessible. What do you look at in terms of the tools that we can use to reconcile these truths of different perspectives?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question.
Yeah, I
Because
know.
I mean, what you encounter. So let me take this apart a little bit, because you said a confined perspective, right? So let's assume there are obstacles to have the truth. So for Plato in the Republic, this was the guardian, the philosopher king, right? So the philosopher king was trained from the early age to see the truth and see the ideals. They were not allowed to have family. They were not allowed to have property, to not be kind of corrupted into a kind of a cave way of seeing the world. So, and as Plato said, the people leading the republic should be those who least want to lead the republic, right? So there was a kind of, if we really have to, then okay. So there were certain ways that it was believed you could get people to see. The problem with the seeing, of course, is twofold. One, how does that exactly work? And looking at the time, I won't be able to show you what we're doing there. So you normally start with like cognitive development theories like Bob Keegan and the likes, and then you go to the moral development theories like Kohlberg and the problems with Kohlberg, and then you go to Resnavis for component model, etc., etc. So there are a number of models that track moral development, and a lot of it has to do with complexity, the complexity of thinking, the number of perspectives that you can see. I hope I have time to show you two more slides which I think are relevant, because we come to this concept of practical wisdom, which for us was the key concept in leadership development. But so the first question, I think, to your confinement is, okay, so maybe there are some ways that we can get people to see stuff, which would always be both seeing deeper into reality and seeing more morally in terms of how to value reality, right? And you always need both. The is not the should, but the two are somehow connected, right? Because the seeing deeper gives you the energy to do what you should be doing. The second question is, are these different perspectives? So if we take the 6 political categories, right, the political ideologies, are they commensurable? Because if there's incommensurability, as the name says, there's no vantage point from which you could possibly compare. It's like Thomas Kuhn said, if you're part of system A, you can seek for coherence in part of system B. But you cannot compare it with, you seek for coherence in system A. But you cannot compare it with system B, because there's no common denominator which would link system A and system B. So the question is, how can we ever decide whether the person who is a neoliberal and loves Ayn Rand and reads Nozick and wants the minimum state, whether that person is wrong when you come in and say, no, we should have some welfare state and we should look after the least favored, as the Vatican would say, right? The preferred option for the poor. You could point him, as Tom did, to the Gospel of Luke and say, well, read the Good Samaritan. You might come out of that with the belief that agape or charity is the right thing to feel. Right? But if they don't feel it, if they don't see it, then what's the argument to get them onto your space? And this is what Nancy Fraser called a common coordinate system. And this is probably the biggest challenge that we've been working on forever. And I don't pretend to have cracked it, but I think what I'm working on is this, which goes to Tom's question. I believe there's an ethical space where identity becomes a question of positioning ourselves within this space. And the space is, as Martin Luther King once said, Justice without care doesn't work. Ethics is justice and care. It's compassion and virtue of justice. And it's both the particular and the universal. If you read Plato's Republic, where Glaucon challenges Socrates to figure out what the virtue of justice is, the answer is that the virtue of justice as individual level is connected to the virtue of justice as institutional level. Ethics is constellationally included in politics. So we need to find a stance where our acting makes the society within which we are, through our role, good. And this is also necessary for meaningfulness, because the problem is, if to make life meaningful, there is no meaning in life. I mean, I don't need to read Camus and Sartre to convince myself that there is no meaning in life as such. The meaning we create by taking up a role within something that makes it meaningful. That's Lacan's view of the big other, right? We cannot liberate ourselves from order. Order is the necessary other half of freedom. Responsibility is the necessary other half of freedom, right? So there's a necessity in an ethical space between an objective justice and a subjective care and compassion in particular, between a material and an immaterial world, to find our space. The one is based on choice, the other is based on needs. But the point is, I need to bring these ideologies in some sort of space where I can compare them. And that's what we are working on. And then I want to be able to say, given the context, this option is superior to the others, right? I might not be able to say what's the ideal, and maybe there is no ideal. And that's the problem with, Tom, your comment on an essentialist logic, right? Where's that essence coming from? Who says what that essence is? Right? We're going back to, then we can try to anthropologically, yeah, but people were they were nice to each other since the beginning of time. Yeah, someone else comes along and said, no, they were not nice to each other. And then you kind of fight over what makes a human human. And then the brain scientists come saying, then, okay, but these synapses start to swing in greater kind of micro stimulated by attachment or whatever. But you're back to the naturalistic fallacy. What is doesn't tell you what should. So if you want to posit an essence that we should all strive for, you have a legitimation problem, right? This is why we are happy that we have the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, because rights is a fantasy, right? Right is something that doesn't exist. We've created a right in order to create limits around, especially the power of the state, right? The power for coercion. That's why we created rights. But if you read John Stuart Mill, you figure out that ultimately the rights are legitimated on God. Right? And not many people, if they claim their rights, are kind of cognizant of the fact that ultimately the only way to say that I have a right for anything is going back to some sort of extra natural lawgiver. Right? So we got to, I don't want to bore you with this stuff, but ethics is really complicated. So I think in terms of getting people to a higher understanding, Gordon, my answer is I think there are ways to do it. To explain why an essentialist position is ultimately superior, I think, is an act of faith. It's an act of personal commitment. And in order to make that act of personal commitment, I think you have to show that other possible commitments are worse. Right? And I think that's kind of the route that we're going.
I think you kind of answered it. When I said tool, you created a space. And I think that's an interesting contrast.
Yeah, because you need a space of comparison. And most of the political scholars will tell you that ideologies are incomparable. Right? And I'm going back to structuralist analysis and language analysis like Saussure and Wittgenstein. And I think you can, Wittgenstein famously said there is no private language. Right? And I think, and then you go to Chomsky and generative language and so on. But I think you can argue the same for ideologies. There are basic components that are comparable. Right? There's always an intrinsic notion of freedom, of justice, of well-being, of solidarity, of common good. You can bring it down to a number of aspects, and those aspects, I think, can create some sort of space. And whilst you cannot posit an answer, this is where dialectics come in. Right? For me, goodness is a continuous strive to be good. Goodness is not, here's a list of ABC and I compare myself against. Goodness is a continuous dialectical kind of holding the space to try to evolve to something better. Right? It's both contingent and universal, because you're comparing your situation, you're seeking a higher ground, a moral ambition, as our friend from the Netherlands called it. What was it called? The Utopia for Realists. Bear Brickman, right? He calls it moral ambition. That's the kind of thing that you need. But if you don't make that moral ambition, your life becomes meaningless. I mean, meaningless in the original sense of purpose, right? An objective meaning, right? Meaning if whatever gives you pleasure, right? Kind of riding your Ferrari or having sex all day or whatever. So all these things on the list of things that give people pleasure. If that's what you call meaning, then you can get away with it. But if meaning has an objective aspect, then you need to find something that is anchored in the order, right? Then the good of your life becomes constitutional for the good of the whole. And you need to figure out how that works.
You're on mute, Tom.
I said you got your hand up and you're the first in line.
That's what I hope you said. I want to switch direction to a level of how and who. First question is, how is it that this investigation goes on in a school of business, which I find wonderful and shocking, but who? You mentioned we, and we are working on this, and we want to crack the next question. So how did it happen, and who is we?
Yeah, this is and I'm sorry, I had a video for you guys where I was showing you, but I will share the video afterwards. A presentation together with Antoinette Weibel, professor of management at the University of St. Gallen. So that's the we plus a number of PhD students who are working on the background research, etc. We have been starting this what is called an engaged scholarship project. So engaged scholarship implies between practitioners and academics. About 4 years ago. Why in a business school? I think there is no reason for that. I think Antoinette and I met and we both looked at each other and we said, okay, this is midlife crisis number 5. We need to make it count. And we kind of found ourselves in this book project, which didn't materialize so far. She has her own institute. So she's got one leg in the business school and another leg in her own institute, which is self-financed, etc. So she can get away with doing stuff that the business school wouldn't easily get away with. I think that's the answer. But that said, we have started about a year and a half ago pilot projects for master student leadership education, which is now running both in Duke University in the US and Orlando University. So we already have 2 business schools where our content is starting to be used, and we hope to expand on that next year with a number of other schools. But I think it will be highly selective. I proposed this to the Australian National University, I think it's called, ANU or something. And they looked at the content and said, you're critiquing capitalism? That will never work. And that was the end of the conversation. I just said, you're pardon my French, you're fucking kidding me, aren't you? So
Yeah.
you really want to tell me that critiquing capitalism doesn't work in a university? I mean, what is a university then, if it's not critical exchange of ideas in the search and quest for truth, right? What is your job if not? It's ridiculous.
I'll just follow quickly with the, and I can't put it in any classification of your slides, but there seems to be, as the case you just cited in Australia, this notion that there is business. It's inviolable, and it is right. And the school of business is built around that. Therefore, the purpose of the school of business is to exclude every other way of thinking, every other practice of business. We're in the business of being the business school. Now, I'm exaggerating because I try to live in one and make a living in one for over 50 years. And I always felt, as a liberally educated person and one who loves hearing what you just gave us today, you're nuts. Business is nothing. There is there's nothing. It's what people construct and believe and act on. So what are you protecting? And your answer is, hey, profit. The people who make profit hire our students. Because
whereas I think
our students will make them more profitable, and the hell with everything else. And if they aren't making us profitable, we eject them. Very straightforward.
Yeah, I do agree. Only that I want to put some agency to the customer as well, right? So when we recently did some analyses on the so-called green premium, so how much are people willing to pay more for a product because it's ethical or green? And the literature was always around 10 to 15%. And we talked to practitioners and they said, well, try to do more than 5% price increase and people will run away. If I look here in Hampstead, right, the amount of Land Rover Defenders, which is the biggest gas guzzling kind of petrol consuming automobile that you can have, that is being driven for 3 kilometers to pick up children from school here, right, or to the farmers market and so on. I mean, the hypocrisy is just stunning. And in the Financial Times until recently, SUVs was the fastest growing and largest new car sales segment in Europe. I mean, what the hell, right? So I want to put some agency also onto the demand side, because as Nozick, I think, rightly says, markets cannot be moral. Price is determined by demand and supply. So there's no moral logic as such in there. And I think Jerry Cohen quite rightly critiques him that his theory of justice doesn't ultimately work because we haven't distributed property in any meaningful way. So what you get in the market is concentration of wealth. I mean, look at the ridiculous Oxfam statistics, right? Where 40% of people live with less than $6.70 a day. And on the other hand, there's 1% having 40% of the assets. I mean, that you have to ask yourself, right? Who thinks this could possibly want, because otherwise I feel I've completely failed my mission to talk about good leadership. So I want to show you 2 more things, and I'm going to only show you those 2. So I failed to show you 40 of my slides, but so be it. Hopefully there was some interesting stuff. But because this was all theory, right? So the next question was, okay, now we've looked at complexity of the world. On that basis, we can see how many constituent interactions businesses have in the economy and the natural sense between each other, other stakeholders. So we see the complexity of the ecosystem. We can also, I think, derive a number of duties in terms of corporate responsibility. Individually, in terms of how they need to treat the economy as an actor, collectively, and this also goes, for example, when the state is weak, right? So if I'm operating in an economy in Africa or somewhere where the state is not providing certain things in the around, I can, as an actor, if I have the opportunity, have a kind of accountability to provide some of that institutional support, right? Which kind of, again, legal scholars make very good arguments for, I think. And then ethically, I think there's an opportunity, at least, so a necessity to treat people well. And we haven't gone into the details, but there are some very important, I think, political theories when it comes to the freedom from domination. That's neo-republicanism under Pettit. Nancy Fraser, when it comes to participatory parity. So there are many good arguments to say stakeholders, and especially employees in organizations, should have minimum rights to kind of be self-determined and autonomous. But that doesn't get you to the question of good, because right is not good. And I think John Rawls, the most famous theory about justice, is theory of justice as freedom. He's making exactly that point, right? It's right before good. And he's arguing that in a liberal society, we can only argue for right, because a substantive version of the good could not be defendable because everybody else has a right to find their own way in life. But I think organizations are companies, cum pane, as the old Latin says, right? People break bread together. They get on a collective endeavor for the good of all. And I think in that context, we can defend a substantive notion of goodness. So in our view, I'll show you the kind of, I finished with you remember the punctuated equilibrium, right? So there's some sort of notion that an ideology is sticky. As we said in T1, we're finding ourselves in ideology. And as Dave pointed out, in business schools, we're finding ourselves in that yellow ideology, if not red, right? The yellow neoliberal, agile adaptiveness, resilience, all these words, they all come back to a profit maximizing instrumental type of paradigm, which is the yellow logic, which is evolved from the red logic, which is my way or the highway, so to speak. It's an authoritarian kind of bureaucracy, if you want, but the yellow is still not where we want it to be. So we've created a model which is similar to what people might know from spiral dynamics or Thiel, using a color scheme of these different equilibria that we think we can make organizations transform into. And again, the transformation is predicated, as we've already discussed here, on the x-axis on consciousness. So that's the understanding of the world, but also the degree of commitment. And to Tom's point, we've put essence at the top of the commitment scale there on the y-axis, if you want. So we are seeing a succession of what we call different action logics, which are these ideologies translated into organizational configurations. Because again, an ideology doesn't only live in the language, right? This is where constructionists, I think, get it completely wrong. The ideology is ingrained in the way we run performance management. It's ingrained in the way that we structure the organizations, whether it's an M form, F form, a sociocracy or holacracy or whatever it might be, right? So the structures, the systems, the success measures, who has a say, all of these are reflective of the type of ideology that is prevalent in an organization. So we are formulating here a normative model, so how organizations should develop based on the yellow as the starting point. The orange is predicated on I think a good consensus of liberal political theory, as I just explained, right? So we're going from a freedom to do where you've got minimum freedom as long as you're maximizing my profit, to a freedom to be where every single participant needs to have a minimum amount of capabilities and rights within an organizational system because they are dignified as human beings. It also implies that we are not benefiting from the environment unduly. So externalities have to be internalized, etc. Right? So we're creating an organization that is just, which has kind of the benefit of stopping the suffering, as we say. So the first action here is stop the harm. And if we look at kind of literature in philosophy and politics, I think the stopping the suffering has the greatest consensus across religious, across political, across social research. If people get harmed, I think that's a consensus most people would be willing to support in saying, okay, we need to intervene. We need to stop the suffering, right? As long as at the same time, we need to also have viability. So there's a minimum constraint in terms of feasibility. Business is a business, but it has to do right at the same time. Otherwise, it loses its license to operate, or at least a moral license. But we're trying to frame the purple paradigm, which is a freedom to become. So it's about growing better together. It's about a type of system. I'll show you the translation of the virtue ethics slide, where the energy that people bring, and more energy because they have more rights in an orange type of system, gets translated into excellence. So the capacity to become our best self in the system. And again, of course, this is based on Aristotelian logic, and we need to find ways to both legitimate and make it real. But this is the kind of transformation journey that we're depicting, and I will share this the Flourish manifesto that we've created. Let me just see if I can find it here. So this is what we published with a lot of HR people at the Global HR Congress last year, with a first indication of the type of HR practices that will be required to make this transformation work, modeled on the Agile manifesto, but going further. But what's the relevance of leadership? Well, the point is that this can never work unless we've got leaders. In my view, the first law of transformation is the development of any organizational system can never exceed the development of its leaders. Because leaders, whether we like it or not, the executive leaders, they cast a long shadow, right? And if they hold the system in a certain ideology because that's what they benefit from, or that's the only thing they understand and know, it's very hard to go elsewhere. So the question that I think, Gordon, you asked was, okay, let's now take this within an organization. How do you go from one ideology to another? And here, as I pointed out earlier, and I'm going to go really fast so we have a few more minutes, you normally go to all these type of stage development models, right? On the right, you've got the IDG, it's kind of internal development goals, which the friends in Stockholm have developed over the last years. But I think all of these don't really get it, because I think they fail to relate the cognitive development, which they're most predicated on, with that initial formula that I kind of intimated when I showed you the very first leadership slide, when I said there's kind of an implicit hypothesis that leaders are able to see the current world and discern what it is. They are able to imagine the future, and they're able to judge which actions bring you from here to there and then execute those. And this for us is what practical wisdom is all about. It's a model whereby we see the world, we imagine what it could be like. We judge which options are best suited to get us where we need to get to, and we act. Only that in a liberal, kind of neoliberal yellow organization, this is predicated, as I said, on truth being my financial statistics, my imagination being free business cases, which I kind of judge based on the biggest profit I get. The judgment is implied, it's the whatever, the NPV that I'm getting, or the IRR, or whatever it might be, and the shareholder return at the end. And then I act, and the action is very often kind of hierarchical, or I treat culture like a product, right, where the executive is determining the new values for the company, and then they get cascaded into the organization, or all sorts of nonsense like that, right? And it sits on a moral ego identity and character, which is limited in that regard. So we need to get people to evolve practical wisdom as the capacity, as it says on the slide on the left, to make and enact good judgment in complex and ambiguous and unknowable kind of situations, where good judgment means good ends and good means, right? That's what wisdom is about. And that is predicated on expanding on these 4 stages. So as we said, the seeing needs to be in that critical system, in all the depth of seeing the interdependencies of how things hang together. But they also need to be empathetic, so to speak, to all the different discourses in the room and the different interests that are being put forward. And ultimately, they need to figure out what is at stake. What are the ultimate values and boundaries that are at stake? Then the second aspect here is an imaginative, creative sparring. In Kant's famous critique of judgment, Kant talks about an aesthetic idea. And this goes back to the ultimate philosophical conundrum, which is between the many and the one. The metaphor of Plato's cave is the many in the real world, the many shadows, the many manifestations of the ideals that we see. This is the empirical observation. The ones are the ideals, the true values that they correspond to. So the fundamental problem that we are, as humans, always struggling with is to see the many things that we are exposed to, all the things that our sense data gives us, internal and external, and the ideas, the concept, the language, the ways we are making sense of the world. And on both sides, the many and the ones, the concepts, we need to figure out whether they are right and best placed to give us the greatest insight. Because even the words we use very often, think about stakeholder theory. Stakeholder theory at Freeman's famous theory is always about the same 5 or 6 stakeholders: the customers, the suppliers, the workers, the financiers, and if you're unlucky, the government or so, right? These are the stakeholders. But what does that mean? It doesn't imply that the most vulnerable, whatever, the black females in Minnesota, they might be customers or they might be workers, but in the concept of worker, they're not included. So you're creating words which are actually not giving you the full understanding of reality. So you always need to investigate both the many, which is what complexity theory kind of does, right? The real world, but also the concepts and the language you're using. And here the imaginative sparring in the second step becomes a moral ambition. It becomes looking at different perspectives, different words, different ways to bring out what the actual situation allows as potentiality, seeing the possible in the actual. The judgment step, as we already said, needs to be a reflective dialectics, trying to get to the approximation of the good that is possible and feasible. And then the practice needs to be both on the individual level, but also on the institutional level. You need to embed habits and virtues in the organizational system. So that for us is the complexity of leadership. And this is why we're saying for us, leadership equals wisdom, because it's the capacity of the individual within the system to kind of take this set of detached, if you want, reflexive steps. Think about, again, the morphogenetic cycle, right? To figure out what the best thing is, stand up for it, and embed it in an organization. And I think that's where I want to close it. So here we kind of show that the types of leadership that you would expect in these different types of ideologies, abstracted here just in those that are based on freedom as the underlying greatest value. In the red, you will find the typical command and control. You'll find agile style of leadership, relational leadership in the yellow. participatory, democratic, workplace democracy, these type of leaderships in the orange, and this kind of wisdom, wise leadership, striving to become the best within the community, within the system, within the ecosystem, etc., in this kind of purple. And then at least I wanted to show you those slides, because then I can claim that we went to wisdom. But you can see the system, right? So from the deep investigation as to what is real, what are all the problems with seeing the world, how it all hangs together, to then defining a normative evolution or transformation pathway for the organization based on the best in psychological in the yellow, the best in political on the orange, the best in moral philosophy on the purple, trying to then figure out how it all hangs together and postulating from there the responsibility of leaders. And what we're now working on is the institutional interventions that will support that. Because again, for me, the leader is, as an individual, not as important as the type of capacity for leaders to enact on the system, so act upon the context, so to speak. But that requires an understanding as to which type of structures, processes, systems, procedures should I use to increase the organizational wisdom, not at an individual level, but that these 4 steps need to be in the governance. Right, so think about the type of governance. You normally have an operation meeting and a policy meeting, and you have a certain agenda and a certain type of participants. That is what organizational wisdom is about. So you need to think about, how can I institutionalize these steps of individual wisdom in an organizational system, right? And then you will see the judgment is very often done at an executive committee or financial committee or a legal committee. They have step 3 in that wisdom process, right? So you need to figure out, how do you connect them back into this kind of organizational wisdom chain. I hope all of that made any sense. This is what one should never do: invite people into the kitchen and show you all the different tools there before the dish is actually done. But
well, I think we could have about 15 follow-up sessions, and maybe take them one course at a time.
We'll see where the gray hair is coming from.
I do think there's an interesting, what I described as a kind of a core operation of leadership, and your wisdom model there at the end. That would be an interesting conversation to have and follow up, or maybe in another session, because I think we're scratching around the same thing there, and I'd love to make some more comparisons. It'd be cool. But we only have 2 minutes left, so other than thank yous, is there any other comments or observations that people could share with us? To just
raise your hand if you feel you have practical wisdom right now.
Yeah.
I hope so. And I think one reason we're all here today is because we seek it. We're not satisfied that we're wise enough or practical enough. But Tom has given us a tremendous forum today, and Otti, wow. Got to know more about you and your work.
Yeah, it's a mess. But it's so complicated, right? I mean, 2,500 years of moral philosophy, all these people, they've never run a business. So
you've shown us that it is complicated. I think it's important to be reminded that before we go merrily espousing this and that notion.
Yeah, so okay, there's lots to process. We'll all watch the video and absorb it again, which I'll get it edited at some point not too far in the distant future. And Otti, if you could share your video that you wanted us to watch, I'll post it with the video or the recording from this. People can also see it there.
Yeah, let me also see if I can quickly find it. You also, by the way, so on leaderships, our project is entirely pro bono. None of it is commercial. Most of it, and I'm about 40 video recordings behind, but most of it is on leadershipsociety.world if you want to look at anything. And the Leaders for Humanity interviews, I have a backlog of 15, 20 that I will publish. But the Business for Humanity interviews are relatively short on each of these alternative paradigms. And if you're interested in that, I really recommend them. I mean, there's some really clever people suggesting these kind of ways that we could make economy better. I think that's really interesting.